So we've got an opportunity now for a little bit of discussion on the two presentations that you've just seen, and I'm not the only one. And I'd just like to welcome Ed McRandall to the stage as well, from Lexington Communications. Do you want to introduce yourself, Ed? Actually?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me, everyone. I'm from Lexington. We're a specialist consultancy. I head up our health division. We work in policy, regulatory, and strategic comms around health. So what the government's doing and the bill is obviously of great interest to us, and really great to be here to talk to you about it with you guys today.
Fabulous. So hopefully I have a couple of different perspectives. I was just going to touch on one of the things that you mentioned, Guy, around funding. I think that's potentially quite interesting to both sort of potential suppliers or innovators, as well as organisations like your own and the trusts and others who will be procuring the sort of digital services. You mentioned what good looks like, and there's also the sort of the payment side of who pays for what, which is quite nicely named. I've had conversations with NHSX about that, and I mean, just so people know, their ambition, certainly in relation to some of the solutions, is around these things being bought at an ICS level, as opposed to the way it works now, which is sort of individual kind of trust or organisational level. And from everything you've said, I think that sounds like that would work really well here in Greater Manchester. And you've clearly thought that all through, and how you're fitting with that. How realistic is all of that, and how do you think, just looking at other areas where they might not be quite so organised, how do you think that's going to play out, and do you think that method will work, basically?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, when I first came in, it's because I come from a commercial background. You go, what actually motivates people and drives people. In reality, it's how they're actually performance managed and how they're targeted. And so the first question is, how does the money actually flow? 80% of the money goes to provider space, 20% goes to CCG land. So if you look at the quantum of the money, a lot of the money still goes into the provider, and that will continue to pay through. I think the key thing that we've managed to do over the last few years is really have a very connected conversation, where you don't have sort of direct control of the money, but you have influence. So I'll give you an example. So we've got some of MFT is the largest provider hospital in the whole of the UK. We've got the NCA, which is a huge footprint as well. We've got some major providers across Greater Manchester, and what we've done is managed to bring all those groups together into a very engaged conversation using the method we talked about, where we're now using a common language. And I think through that process, what it's enabled us to do is we've had a very transparent conversation. So in the sense that we don't gameplay to say, we've done a level of maturity, we've assessed ourselves, and we've had it marked by each other. So what that means is that when we present nationally now, we present a unified front of our overall requirements, as opposed to taking a very organisational view. And I think the method that we've been through has been a key enabler. I think the key lesson I've learned is that actually collaboration is a hand-to-hand sport, and actually the way you make collaboration work, whether there's a legal basis to do it or not, collaboration is really important, and that's based on fundamentally building trust and executing and being absolutely transparent. So one of the things that I think we've been really successful at is to create a digital transformation board. That digital transformation board has clinical, operational, digital and finance senior leadership from the whole of Greater Manchester, so we now make unified decisions. So I think there's some key things that certainly if I was going into another ICS, the number one thing would be to form a strategic leadership board that had ownership of the agenda. The key thing, I suppose the other key thing, is that from a digital perspective, it needs to be owned at the top of the shop. Often, digital is seen as a techie thing that's in the corner. Fundamentally, the ability for us to transform service delivery is fundamentally enabled by digital, and so therefore it cannot be separate from the transformational agenda of an ICS. So key recommendations: owned at the top of the shop, have a transformation board that has got representative of clinical operation and digital and finance people on it.
Fabulous, thank you, Guy. Ed, do you want to come in on any of that? Or
I think the point that I think is really key, this guy mentioned there, is around how you actually implement this collaboration in practice. Because I think it's all well and good getting this kind of edict from the centre that says you must collaborate, but it's actually how we do that in practice is going to be the challenge. And I think that's going to be one of the big things that we see over the next year, 2 years, is how that works in different localities. And I think, you know, thanks to Guy and others working in Manchester, Manchester's in a great position for that, because it has a lot of the structures that exist via the devolved settlement to deliver that. But that's not true in a lot of other areas. They don't have that legacy of partnership. And I think that's particularly true on digital as well. And it's the reason why within the bill you have such a focus on mandating data sharing, because so many areas aren't doing it because they don't have the processes, they don't have the relationships to do it. And fundamentally, I think that's going to be a big challenge that, you know, it's all well and good putting it through Parliament and talking about all the various machinations of it, but it's going to be how it exists at that local level and how people work together. And ultimately, when you have those two elements of ICSs, the boards and the partnerships, is how they work together, who holds the power within it ultimately, and who sets the agenda is going to be quite key for how that integration and collaboration exists. So I think that's a big one to watch over the next year or so.
Yeah, I think we're quite fortunate here, aren't we, that in a sense, a lot of these structures that are now being put in place by legislation for Greater Manchester are just being sort of laid on top of existing relationships that have been ongoing for some time. So it's the right way round, really. And then equally, you look at the success of things like the GM shared care record, etc. You know, that's something that a lot of other places just do not have. So we're already in a really great position. But as you say, how is, you know, if we were speaking in another part of the country, maybe having a very different conversation. So I'm just going to open it up to the floor or the audience online at this stage. If anyone's got any questions that they would like to ask Victoria, and then Taz.
Oh, thank you. I'm Victoria Martin. Thank you. It's really interesting talks.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, hello, can everyone, is that on? No. Okay, it will be, okay. I have a question about the ICS and how you're going to have a conversation or a joined up conversation with innovators and entrepreneurs and digital health companies who can potentially help you. So as we know at the moment, if you're a small company, and I'm sure Taz will reinforce this one, you know, your point of sale is every single trust, CCG, and there's a real opportunity to procure in a more organised fashion, and to make it simpler for the marketplace to come and speak to you. So could you talk a bit about how that's going to play out, please?
Yeah, if you could, please. Yeah, that'd be great.
So, like, I feel your pain. So, you know, coming from industry, you know, stepping into the NHS, and I always felt one step removed from industry, from a tech perspective. And that's why I stepped down to, you know, how do we recognise most of the challenges in people, process, and cultural change. Actually, to get something landed, what you realise when you're in the system is you need to have clinical, finance, digital, and operational buy-in to whatever you're doing. And that's quite complicated because, you know, just going to the CIO is, you know, you think, you know, I used to try and sell to the CIO, and you go, well, actually, you know, then you need to sell to the director of finance, then you need to sell to operations. So I think so I suppose two sort of key points. So one is the academic health science networks. If you've heard of the academic health science networks, their job is to help small, medium, you know, industry navigate the NHS. So Health Innovation Manchester, which is where I work, includes an academic health science network, and its role is to essentially drive innovation to frontline staff from both industry and academia. So first practical thing is contact your local AHSN. So from Manchester, Greater Manchester, that's Health Innovation Manchester. So you can just drop myself and Peter an email, and we'll put you through our process. What we've done in Greater Manchester is come up with an innovation pipeline. So very much like you'd see in other sort of commercial industries, how you go from, you know, horizon scanning to qualifying. How do we qualify an opportunity? And that qualify opportunity from an industry perspective is, what's the scale, the size of the prize, how many people will it impact, what's the challenge of delivery? And then from qualification, we will then go into what we call solutioning, which is understanding about how we land that capability within the locality, and what is the people, process and cultural wrap around it. And then from that, we go into proof of value, which is actually deployment of a capability in live within, for example, a neighbourhood or locality. And then the final decision is, do we roll it out at scale across GM? So I think certainly the HSNs can help with that network. I think in Greater Manchester, we're probably quite sophisticated in terms of our qualification industry engagement process, but if you've got any specific questions, more than happy to help you navigate through that. The final point is, whichever way you navigate, you still need to have a clear value proposition that speaks to different target audiences. So it needs to be wrapped around the patient fundamentally, but you need to have a clear message around how you're going to sell to the CFO, how you're going to sell to the CIO, how you're going to sell to the clinical team, how you're going to sell to the operational team, which is no other, no different to any other business you should be in.
Yeah, I mean, I just just build on Guy's last point. As he said actually in his talk, it's about when you approach these things, it's looking at the problem, not the product. So actually, when you go to have that conversation, is saying, here's the problem we're trying to solve, but actually looking at what the ICSs produce insofar that they'll have to have their partnership plan, their forward view that will be looking at it. So kind of making sure you're talking to them on those problems that they have identified that they need to solve. And fundamentally, if you're talking at odds with that, you're talking at odds of the direction of travel where they're going. So they should be a great template for how you can have these conversations and the ways in which you should phrase them. But I'd agree with definitely everything Di said about the ways in which you should do it as well.
Yeah, I think that I suspect we're never, I'll be the pessimist, sorry. I suspect we're never going to get to a point where it's like there's a one-stop shop, is there, where any innovator can just rock up and there's sort of one person that you can go to in the whole of GM and pitch your idea to, and that's that. But as you say, the Health Innovation Manchester and the HSNs across the country are obviously a good start, and Victoria and I know there are other organisations as well out there. But yeah, it's something that we get lots of queries from startups, and one of the first things that they say is, I've got this amazing solution to a problem, but I can't actually get, how do I get it bought? How do I sell into the NHS? And I'm blessed. I sort of, okay, it's not as easy as that. Sorry.
Follow-up question, because you haven't answered my question actually. It wasn't about how do you sell to the NHS, it's what's going to be different with ICSs. So obviously the HSNs have been around for a while. What I'm curious about is, as the ICSs are organising themselves, what will be different in terms from an ICS perspective, rather than reaching out rather than companies reaching in, if that makes sense?
Sorry, so you mean the ICS?
Yeah, as integrated care systems form and join up as you're describing, what will be different, not from an HSN point of view, but from an ICS point of view?
Well, I can speak to for Greater Manchester perspective. So we're pretty clear about what our digital priorities actually are. So I think the onus is, so on that list of 47, we know exactly the stack rank order of those. So when we go out to the market and engage industry, it's absolutely specific to those elements. So I don't know how sophisticated the ICS is, but we're certainly using that framework to be able to guide what we do. I think the other key thing is that from an ICS perspective, certainly from a Health Innovation Manchester perspective, our ambition is very much, tailored to how do we drive economic growth, how do we do job creation in Greater Manchester, how do we support the life sciences industry. So I think we're really targeted about where we're trying to get to. But if you need any specifics, more than happy to help navigate it. Clearly in other areas, you're probably not getting that sort of sense. But Health Innovation Manchester should be your front door from an engagement perspective to help you navigate. Now, we can't promise that it will go your way, but what we can promise is that we will consider it through the pipeline process that we've established and map it to our prioritised areas.
Thanks, Taz.
Good morning, and thanks for great talks as well. I'm Taz Algood, I'm the founder and CEO of Dockerbo Workforce Platform. I'm also a GP, and couldn't agree more with something you said, Guy, around the 3-to-1 ratio. Well,
yep.
You get the money for the tech, and even with an evidence-based, proven solution, how do you create the bandwidth for people that are just too busy to do anything new? Because it's so difficult. Even just rolling out vaccines, we've got a proven solution, but as a GP, there's never any funding to support the mobilisation, and that's, I guess, it's a challenge we have.
Do you mind if I respond to that?
So,
look, it's always a challenge, right? And some of the challenges are that actually the NHS is giving capital funding, which is a challenge rather than revenue. But that comes down, that's deeply ingrained about how the NHS is funded. I mean, one of the things that we're certainly doing is, as we go through that very structured qualification process, we hold the Digital Transformation Board account to go, look, there's no, the totality of the investment you're making needs to cover that 3-to-1 ratio in terms of the implementation charge around it. Now, if it's compelling enough, they'll execute. If it's not, it won't. It's like any other business. What is the compelling case for action, both in terms of clinical outcome, improving people's health, economic saving, and then if those things all plus master, it should actually get passed. It's telling in itself if actually you can't build a case around it that's compelling, which means that you won't roll it out. So I think, but that said, I think I totally appreciate it's really difficult for individual providers and industry to connect individual point parts to the system. You need to go at the right level to have that sort of conversation to be able to create that compelling case for action. But yeah, it's either compelling or it's not, in short.
So I guess really good at getting in at a senior level, getting a CFO sign off, getting all that board you talked about. But you said it's about business, proper transformational stuff. It's about business processes, redesigning them, and you're going into a busy, whether it's at a PCN level or a practice level, and there's just no one there to actually do that piece of work. So I think I'm really, getting the funding to actually get the people to do all the implementation, real experts who know what they're doing, not just project management, but proper business analysis and that redesign. It's just absolutely essential.
No, absolutely.
It seems to always be missing.
So let me give you an example right now. So we know, for example, primary care is a real challenge, right? So we've got individual GP practices that are really flying and using some of the digital tech. Some of them are switching off in the afternoon because the workload coming in through that channel is really difficult. So we've done a 2-month piece of deep engagement with 10% of our practice, so 50 practices with clinicians, patients, clinical staff to truly understand what are the things, the biggest levers that will actually make a difference. That program is now being rolled out. One of the key things is how do we create digital facilitators on the ground in practices to help you enable that change. So when you go into practice by practice, while we've rolled out, a virtual consultation or a digital front door, is it rolled out consistently? No. Is the patient experience consistent? No. Is the practice, when we've deployed it, have we given them any guidance about how you manage workflow in the practice? Because fundamentally, some of those digital channels mean that you work differently. So you triage before you move it on. So one of the key things that we're doing is actually that. So we're running an enabling program. But to your point is how do you get systemic change on the ground? The approach that we're taking just from a primary care perspective is we're going to invest in digital facilitators that are targeted to working with practices on the ground to help implement a consistent blueprint where appropriate, both in terms of channel access, but also operating model design. Interesting, we're doing a deep piece of work around engagement at the moment around digital channels. So looked at all the digital channels around how people actually engage with them, and we're working with the mayoral priorities of the key areas of inequality. So people over 65, people under 18, and people with disability. And we've done some deep user experience design, looking at each of the products. We're about to publish some of the results around there, and they're quite startling in terms of what that's coming out with, in terms of how do we get much better and more effective at generating a seamless experience, and that seamless experience being absolutely entwined with the physical experience, because it's almost like we have these two things and it's either or. We need to get much more of it's blended. When you go to an Apple store, you go into an Apple store and you feel like it's a physical experience, it's like your digital experience. So there's something that I'm certainly passionate about, is how you create compelling people experience, and I think that's the next thing that we really need to focus on to drive that sort of engagement.
Thank you, Guy. Ed, I was just going to ask you, and
Sure.
nicely introduce us to the next section. Just looking at the bill and the move towards more integration and collaboration. In your opinion, what this means for policy and regulation around digital health?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's not masses within the bill itself about digital and health around data. As I mentioned before, there's a big push on the greater sharing of data, the fact that individual areas will be required to share it. The Secretary of State has a power of intervention to move it forward. And I think that's one of the areas that you will see a lot of progress in. In fact, you should, and you'll see actually the centre stepping in to ensure that process happens. If not, I think that, one of the, I think clearly, to answer that question, I think you have to look more broadly at the direction of travel that the NHS is facing, and indeed the challenges in elective recovery and kind of bouncing back from COVID, and digital is a really key part of doing that, be it in terms of how we do consultations, in terms of how you do even diagnosis actually sometimes. So I think that's going to be a really kind of key part of it. I think what's going to be quite interesting is if you see, when we talked about earlier, that Secretary of State having that power at the centre, is whether that's actively used to promote digital, because we know that the government has said we want a massive focus of that, and that might be one of the areas that they actually exercise to drive that forward, and that will be quite key. And I think one of the early signs that they'll want to do more in and around that is the fact that you would have seen as part of the associated processes around the bill is that they have merged a lot of the various digital bodies, NHSX, NHS Digital, which is principally because they want greater control and greater ability to work with them and set direction around how digital is rolled out. So I think whilst the bill will have an impact, the bill itself will have an impact on data sharing, I think what's key is the direction of travel that it demonstrates and it speaks to. And I think, look, digital is one of the big priorities of the government, albeit they get spooked by Daily Mail headlines about people not seeing their GPs and the usual kind of political things. But digital will be a big push from the government. The challenge will be Manchester's clearly doing it very, very well and has a great infrastructure. And to speak to the gentleman's question, the challenge is going to be in areas that don't have that infrastructure, don't have that front door, is how much you get that push from the centre with the new powers to make sure that we have a greater focus on it. But digital is definitely a big priority that's here to stay.
Thank you. Got a minute or two left until we move on to the next session, so if we've got that's brilliant. Thank you.
I'll squeeze one last question and thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Michael Luger, the chairman of the Northern Care Alliance. Guy mentioned us as one of the larger providers now in England, the amalgamation of Bury, Oldham, Rochdale, and Salford. You all pointed out all the positive things happening in Greater Manchester. No doubt about it. We have a 15-year head start in devolution. The ICS is moving along at pace. But let's not forget the real challenge that Greater Manchester faces, and that is what we call the donut. The differences in sophistication and resources in the center of that donut, MFT, Salford Royal, versus the outside, the Boltons and the Rochdales, Oldhams, Wiggins. How are you addressing that disparity, say, in digital resources?
Oh, it's a great question. So I'll ask the question. So one of the key things so we have a CIO forum every week, as you maybe know, with John and Joe and Tracy and all the team there. And I think one of the key things that we've done is through this digital maturity, which we've co-created with each of the providers, is actually have that grown-up conversation where actually when we're doing bidding now, so I think we've attracted quite a lot of funding recently, and the reason why we've been successful in that, because we have a joined-up approach and we have a grown-up conversation to say actually MFT and Salford Royal are quite sophisticated in this area. Let Bolton bid in this particular element to get that funding. And so for the first time we have really great conversations in a grown-up way with all the CIOs going, you should do that, you should do that. And I think to be honest, you're right. It's we've got away from this per organisational sort of view. We take a much more sort of integrated, balanced view. But at the end of the day, this is about trust and people collaborating together. And I think we've just built quite a trusting network in that group that enables us to have, sort of grown up and sensible conversations. I think nationally, there's a lot of focus on level up, to your point, which is, targeting that sort of investment. And that sort of helps in certain ways, but, it doesn't help in other ways. So, we're doing it by working together essentially and having those grown-up conversations. It's no more sophisticated than that, and having sensible, you should do that, we should do that. conversation.
I mean, anything I would add on that is actually what the opinion of, central government is almost in answer to that question, which is that in terms of the devolution, Manchester, I think it's really positive, done really great thing. But one of the great challenges is exactly what you said, that you had great stuff from the centre, but how that was filtered down, maybe at a trust level or a kind of in that donut system. And one of their kind of criticisms was that actually, trusts weren't always necessarily following that direction from the centre, and you had it more disjointed than it should have been. Whether that's fair or not, I'll leave people to decide. But their answer to that is that ICSs should provide a better mechanism to reflect that, in the sense that you'll have not only the board, but you'll have that wider partnership, and that should provide an added layer of that kind of cooperation and almost compulsion sometimes to deliver this as part of those strategies. Now you can ask, what's the difference between health and wellbeing boards? Will that actually make anything different? But that's almost the answer if you talk to someone in government about what they would say is the devolution was great, but ICSs allow it to go further. I'll let you be the judge of whether that will work. But
absolutely, time will no doubt tell. Thank you. That was a fantastic question. So thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next agenda item now, and I'm going to invite Henry to come up to the stage, if that's okay, Henry. He's going to do a session on the Tech UK's 10-point plan for health tech, followed by a panel.